Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? You well? Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much for turning out to join us this evening for what promises to be an absolutely fascinating and really important and really timely discussion. My name is Aisha Hazarika. I'm going to be your chair and your host for this evening. I used to work in politics. I am now a broadcaster. I'm also a former stand-up comedian. I think that was a good introduction into politics, and that was a very, very good training ground. And I'm delighted to be hosting this event. This is the second event that I've hosted for UCL, and they're doing a really important piece of work called Disagreeing Well. I know many of you will have heard some of the work that they've been doing. And what we're going to be focusing on this evening is how to disagree well in public life. And the last discussion we had a really big focus on social media and how we all conduct ourselves on social media, and about how, as a society, we are becoming more atomized and more polarised. And I'm sure everybody, wherever you are on the social spectrum or on the political spectrum, does feel that very keenly at the moment. But I think there's a really big argument that the people who set the tone in society are our political leaders and our leaders in public life as well. And, you know, all across the world, you're looking at, real polarisation in politics and a real coarsening of the discourse in politics and public life as well. And that actually, I believe, does have a really big knock-on effect in terms of how we have these really big debates, how we have these big debates in politics, how we have these big debates on television, on social media, which is the sort of new public square, and how we have these debates and disagreements amongst ourselves, amongst our friends, amongst our family, amongst our work colleagues as well. It does feel that a big theme that UCL has been picking up on is that people really find it hard to know how to disagree. And I think one of the things that we often sort of lull ourselves into thinking, which is not true, is that everybody has to get along and agree on everything to be friends or rub alongside each other. That's not the case. You know, diversity of thought is a really good thing. People are allowed to have fundamentally different views from you, and you should be able to sort of debate and argue with passion, with evidence, with good humour, without it necessarily kind of severing your connections with people and severing your friendships and your relationships with people. And I think that's something that we all feel really keenly about. And of course, there are huge issues that are happening in society, in our own country, all across the world right now. And people feel rightly really passionate, and whatever views they have, they do hold those views with a great deal of, you know, genuine passion and emotion about what they feel. And I think one of the things that I've been really struck by, particularly in the world I inhabit, which is sort of politics and journalism as well, we've almost kind of lost the art of how to have these conversations and how to have these debates. We often are reduced to sort of picking a side and just attacking people individually and on a personal level, rather than actually getting into the substance of the debate. And I was really struck, actually, when I was lucky enough to chair the last debate. There was a brilliant young student from UCL, and she actually said during the debate, and she said to me afterwards, with the people I have around me, it's like we're not being taught how to disagree. It's almost like we're frightened of disagreement, but we know that disagreement is going to happen in our lives. We know that everybody's not going to agree with us. So I think there's some really, really important discussions to be had. And we've got a brilliant panel, but I'm also really keen to hear from you in the audience, and there's many people watching from home as well, so we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. And also, if you're watching remotely, you can send your questions in on the Slido. Let's just pray it works, because last time it didn't work, but let's hope for the best on that. But we'll try and get through as many questions as well. Let me introduce you to our illustrious panel, who have all, really thought deeply about this issue, and they've actually been quite affected by it in their own lives as well. So they have kind of real skin in the game on this important issue. We have Luke Trill, who's a brilliant pollster. He's the UK director of More in Common, and they do fantastic work. They do lots of really meaty political polling that you'll see on the front pages of all the newspapers, but they also do really interesting polling on social attitudes and things around these kind of quite polarising issues. So he's a great person to have on the panel. We have Luciana Berger as well, former Labour MP. She's also conducting a big sort of review for the Labour Party on mental health. She's also chair of the Maternal Mental Health Alliance. And Luciana's had a lot of experience, quite a tough experience actually, of what it's like to be in the heat of real sort of disagreement in politics, particularly on the front line. Delighted to have Sue Moore with us as well. Now, Sue is the CEO of the Jo Cox Foundation, and many of you, of course, will know that name, Jo Cox. And for the large part, disagreement can be uncomfortable, it can be pretty nasty on social media. But for Jo Cox, and indeed for David Amess, two MPs, that hatred moved off the screen and entered real life. And Jo Cox was, as we all know, tragically murdered in 2016. And of course, David Amess was another MP. So Sue does great work with the Jo Cox Foundation, which tries to bring people together. Jo Cox, actually, she would have turned 50 this year had she lived. One of her big sort of touchstone mottos in life is more in common, and that is something that, you know, we're all trying to sort of strive for. We're also delighted to have Jeff Howard here, who is Associate Professor of Political Philosophy and Public Policy here at UCL, and of course is somebody who thinks about this stuff a lot, and, you know, where are the limits in terms of how we disagree well, how to do it well in an academic setting where, you know, 1,000 intellectual ideas should bloom, even if they do rub up against each other. And delighted to have Ryan Shorthouse with us, who is the executive chair of a really interesting think tank called Bright Blue, which is on the sort of right of politics, but it's more in the centre-right of politics. And Ryan does a lot of deep thinking about sort of young people, about how to have a better tone in politics at a time when politics is pretty leery at the moment. So how we're going to organise this, we're just going to hear from our panel first. They're going to give us a sort of short opening gambit. Then we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then we will come to questions. So I'll just let Luke pour me a glass of water, because it's nice to be looked after when you... it's nice to sort of have a bit of, butler service there. Thanks very much. And so Luke is going to start off by telling us some of the work that he does with his company, More in Common.
Brilliant, thank you. And thank you all for coming. I think this is such an important topic, and I think there's sometimes a temptation to assume that it's a topic which only affects those who have skin in the game, those who are politicians or senior campaigners, the people most affected. But one of the things which we know from our research is that that isn't true. In fact, in our most recent survey on division in the UK, which we carried out in January, 62% of the public said that they felt exhausted by division in politics. Now, that's not just didn't like division in politics or thought it wasn't a good thing. It's the fact that they felt exhausted by it. It's a much more powerful emotion. And what that says to me is that the tone of much of the current debate isn't serving the people that it's supposed to serve well enough. I also want to say at this point, I was really struck after some of them perhaps slightly provocative, not all of them fully formed, but just to see what you and the rest of the panel think about them. I think the first thing to say is that disagreeing well doesn't mean not disagreeing. And it certainly doesn't mean avoiding controversial or complex issues. One of the really interesting things that we found in work that we've done on EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, is that people are broadly supportive. They like EDI. They think it leads to better outcomes. But where they don't like it is where they're told that they can't ask questions, where they're told that actually there isn't space to debate some of the issues involved, that it's a set of diktats that they've got to follow. And I think that goes right up from workplaces, and I'd say they're quite key in public life, up to politicians. The number of politicians who've said to me, do you know what, I'm just not going to talk about trans. I'm not going to talk about the conflict in the Middle East because it's just not worth it. But the problem is, when politicians do that, they cede the ground to those at the extremes who have no such qualms about making their views heard. And I think there's a real premium on, we sometimes call them in-group moderates at More in Common, making their voice heard in some of these controversial debates. But the second thing to say, the second mistake we make, is to assume that disagreeing well or social cohesion more generally is about ceding the floor to the loudest voices. It was I don't know if any of you have read Sarah Khan's Social Cohesion Review, but one of the case studies in there was from Batley Grammar School, and that was where there was a teacher who showed in a lesson a photo of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, you can debate whether he should or shouldn't have done that. There are strong arguments against doing it. There are arguments about why he did it. But what happened then was that there were big protests in the school, and the local authority and local politicians thought that their duty was to calm everything down at the expense of that individual teacher, who is still in hiding, as the report says, is suffering from PTSD, because the answer was, let's just make sure things get a bit quieter. So I think that the second point is, don't just give in to the loudest voices. I think the third point is about forgiveness. And not just forgiveness, but how do we kind of pull people back when they've gone too far in a debate? Some of you will agree with this, some of you will disagree, but I think an interesting case study of this is J.K. Rowling. I think when J.K. Rowling first entered into the debate around gender identity, she was voicing some kind of, deeply held concerns. She was worried. She talked about her own experience of domestic abuse and how that played into things. She then got piled on, as we saw. People disagreed with her. They're right to that. Some people went very far. She got death threats. She got doxxed. And now, I think the things which J.K. Rowling says actually border on quite offensive quite a lot of the time. And is there a mechanism in all of this about how we pull people back, how we stop them from going that extra step, from feeling, as some people might put it, I don't like this word, but cancelled? Can we pull them back? And then, absolutely key is how do we disrupt the incentives? Because let me tell you, the one thing that should get politicians to stop being uncivil or demonising opponents or engaging in culture wars would be if it had an electoral cost. We actually did some work at More in Common with 38 Degrees, which found that actually culture war rhetoric was more likely to turn voters off than it was to engage them. And it particularly was likely to turn swing voters off. But we've got to do more to get that into the zeitgeist, into politics, into the media as well. And then finally on this, and then I will stop, I think it's about recognising that people don't have stacked identities, and someone you disagree with on one issue can be someone that you agree with on another issue. And the great example of this is Suella Braverman. I bet you didn't expect me to say that. So Suella Braverman, there is lots that I personally, and I'm sure lots of you might disagree with Suella Braverman. Suella Braverman wrote a really powerful piece this weekend in The Telegraph where she outlined her opposition to the two-child benefit cap, and was basically saying she thought it was penalising families, pushing them into poverty. Now, there are lots of people that would say, I will never work with Suella Braverman because of what she says about migration. Actually, wouldn't a better way to be say, we'll never agree on that, but actually on this is an area we can get behind and work with her. And because that's how ordinary people think. Ordinary people aren't just always right or always left. They take bits. They don't have these stacked identities. And I think a bit more of that would help to disrupt some of these binaries. And that's it for me.
Brilliant. Let's give Luke a round of applause. That was very some really, really interesting points there. And something I'm really keen to hear from you on is some of the things that Luke's just spoken about. Particularly, do you think the culture wars actually do switch people off, or do you think they are quite a motivating factor? Because there's a counter-argument to what Luke says, which is you look at somewhere like America, where Donald Trump did inflame the culture wars, and that worked very well, because even though the majority of Americans might not agree with him, that election is won in 6 states. And if you can swing a few swing voters on culture war issues, then maybe that sort of disproves your point. But I'm very keen to hear that from you. And also the idea of kind of cancellation versus compassion, and is there a way back for people? Because it does feel that that's quite a kind of an issue of our age. And to your point about unlikely bedfellows, I sit on the board of a brilliant charity called Reprieve, which campaigns against the death penalty all around the world. And we did a lot of work around the case of Shamima Begum. And one of the unlikeliest allies we found was in one Jacob Rees-Mogg. I know, life comes at you fast, doesn't it? Who knew? Sue, let's hear from you now, your thoughts.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. So the Jo Cox Foundation exists to make positive change on issues that Jo was passionate about, and was formed a couple of months after her murder back in 2016. And one of the big pieces of work that we've been undertaking in the last year that I want to talk specifically about now is the Jo Cox Civility Commission. I have its report here, I'm never very far from it. The Jo Cox Civility Commission set about trying to find implementable solutions to the issue of abuse and intimidation of elected politicians. We worked with stakeholders across the political spectrum and key experts, and we've put together 28 recommendations that we think, if implemented, will have a proper effect on this issue. So when we talk about abuse and intimidation of elected politicians, we're talking about the fact that we have had 2 MPs murdered in the last 8 years here in the UK, and we have MPs who are facing constant threats. They have protesters at their homes. They have Jess Phillips, for example. She talked about one night where she had 60 rape threats on Twitter. So this is a constant bombardment that our MPs and local councillors are facing. And we see that this has got an impact on democracy as a whole. We see MPs stepping back. There are a number of MPs who've already said they won't stand at the next election, including Mike Freer, who Luke mentioned. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that says that people just aren't standing in the first place because they just don't want to put up with the abuse and intimidation. And it's also tempering what our politicians talk about. So the Fawcett Society did some research, and they found that about 3/4 of female MPs said that there are issues they just won't even talk about because they know that they will have social media pylons. So this is having that impact on our democracy. And for us, there's a very personal reason that we do this work, and it's not because of the way that Jo died, but Jo was really passionate about empowering other women into politics. And we know that this abuse and intimidation particularly impacts women, as it does politicians from minority ethnic backgrounds and disabled politicians. So we've set out to try and put forward these recommendations that we are working to get implemented to really make a change on this. And I won't go through all 28 because I've been told I've got 3 minutes, but the 2 that I really wanted to put forward to have a particular relevance on this issue, one of those recommendations that we have said is that politicians have to model good behaviour. And I'm asked this all of the time when I'm interviewed for TV and radio, but if politicians can't show respect to each other and they can't show respect to the public, why should the public respect them? So we absolutely do think there's a role for politicians to play. And the second thing that I wanted to highlight was around political education, which came up time and time again in our stakeholder interviews, that the general public just do not know what politicians do. They don't know the difference between what local councillors do and what MPs do. If you're in a devolved administration, there's a whole extra layer of complication there as well. So we've put a number of calls in our recommendations around things like political literacy in schools, but also awareness raising for the general public about who their elected representatives are and what they do, because we think that actually to have that better level of debate, people need to be informed about what the subjects are they're debating and who the people representing them are.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Sue. That's very... Yeah, and I think, you know, the issue of MPs being models of good behaviour is really, really important. And look, I don't think there's ever like a sort of golden age where all sort of politicians were sort of brilliantly behaved, but you do look at the sort of insults that are hurled at each other and also the kind of insults that are hurled at other groups in society as well, how people are are demonised. We have Prime Minister's Questions every Wednesday, something which I've been heavily involved in through my political career, but it's probably not the best sort of shop window for kind of good debate. Although to Luke's point, I think it's quite bland and a bit Pollyanna-esque to say everybody just needs to be kind and get along, because politics is really passionate. People have a fundamentally different view about how to organise society and organise really important services, from health to education, on ideological grounds. So there has to be a kind of sweet spot where you can have a sort of spirited, passionate debate, which is not all kind of sanitised, but is not quite as kind of like feral as it has been of late. Right, let's hear from Jeff Howard now. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks so much. So I'm a philosopher, so unsurprisingly, I'm going to drop back a bit and think about the fundamental principles that should guide us in this space. And when I teach introductory political philosophy, we always look at the classic 1859 essay on liberty written by John Stuart Mill, himself a philosopher and a member of Parliament. And one of the central arguments that Mill gives us in chapter 2 of that great work, which I encourage everyone to read, is that there's enormous value in engaging those with whom we deeply disagree for 3 reasons. The first reason that I should talk to people with whom I deeply disagree is that I might be wrong and they might be right. And the only way to figure that out is to get all the relevant arguments on the table and work through them together. And that's difficult, and it's emotional, and it's messy, but we have to do it to test our convictions. The second reason is that even if I'm mostly right, the person with whom I disagree might have a really important point. There might be a crucial grain of truth in their position that I've overlooked. And the only way to figure that out, again, is by engaging with them. And the last reason why it's so important to engage with people with whom I deeply disagree is that even if I'm clearly in the right and they're in the grip of some manifestly foolish or wicked conviction, there's still value in engaging with them, because it helps me, first of all, refresh my understanding of why I believe what I believe by working through, once again, why those are my convictions. Otherwise, Mill thought they became what he called a dead dogma. It's valuable to the person that I'm debating, because I might be able to persuade them to change their mind on this issue. And of course, it's valuable most of all, Mill thought, to the bystanders, the audiences, who were watching us engage in this sincere engagement of ideas. So for those reasons, I think there's enormous value in engaging those with whom we deeply disagree. And so my first main recommendation is that we need to embrace public life with more of this Millian spirit, characterized by this sense of epistemic humility, the sense that I might be wrong. And the reason is that so many of the big disagreements we have in public life are really difficult. They're complicated public policy issues on which people of good faith and comparable intelligence have thought through the issues, and they've come to different points of view. And when you think of our political disagreements in that light, it becomes much harder to cast those with whom you disagree as villainous or moronic or traitorous. It's much more difficult to demonize and vilify them. So that's my first recommendation. Embrace politics with a sense of greater epistemic humility. My next recommendation is to constantly be on the lookout for ways in which we can reduce our disagreements. Now, a lot of times in life, there is no pressure to reduce our disagreements. If you think Rachmaninoff is the best and I think Taylor Swift is the best, that's fine.
You're right. Clearly
I am
right.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial point, because observing the fact that disagreements are reasonable doesn't mean there isn't a right answer. Taylor Swift is better than Rachmaninoff. But there's no pressure to make up your mind on that question. If you think strawberry ice cream is better than mint chocolate chip and I think the opposite, that's fine. But in politics, there is pressure for greater convergence. And the pressure comes first from the fact that politics is about decisions that we collectively take together. And if we don't have some amount of convergence, then there can be paralysis, and we can't engage in the requisite collective action. But even when we are able to engage in collective action, the risk of thinking that we deeply disagree with one another and that the people who are implementing their agenda hold views that are completely alien and hostile to mine is that it can estrange me from my fellow citizens, and it can even alienate us from the society in which we live, and that can be hugely dangerous. So that's why my second recommendation is to just always be on the lookout for ways you can reduce our disagreements. You might agree with someone about a policy issue, but you might have different reasons for agreeing that it's the right policy, for thinking it's the right policy issue, and that's totally fine. And the last thing to say is that even when you've gone through all of this process and you've been open to the possibility that you might be wrong and you've searched for ways to reduce the disagreement, be content with the fact that disagreement will always persist. It isn't going to go away. Pluralism is the inevitable result of the free exercise of reason under free institutions, John Rawls once said. And so the final reason to engage with people with whom we deeply disagree is not just about improving or seeking the truth. It's about reconciling ourselves to one another and seeking the kind of mutual understanding that I think democracy depends on.
Great stuff, Jeff. Thank you. So many important points there, but I mean, couldn't agree with you more about the need for politicians and all of us who have a strong view. As somebody who writes newspaper columns as well, I think sometimes columnists, you never sort of, you don't sometimes want to engage with other people, and you should do, because sometimes you need to stress test your own convictions, to stress test if they still do stand, if your convictions still stand, if your arguments still stand. But it's amazing how people can just get into a real comfort zone where they just don't seek people out they disagree with, and they end up curating a world where everybody just has the same views. Now we're going to hear from Luciana Berger. Luciana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and I think it's a really important series and event that the university is doing, and thank you for the invitation. I was reflecting on the research that Luke just shared and some other facts and figures that I found in preparation for today, and I was struck there's something called the Edelman Trust Barometer that's been going for over 20 years, and it looks at views within countries and people's perceptions, and it's particularly striking, I think, that here in the UK we're in the zone of being in danger of severe polarisation. There's only a few countries that kind of sit above us on the table, and that is looking both at people having very entrenched views and also people's perception of how divided we are. And on both of those axes, we are, I think, as a country, heading in the wrong direction. And why does it matter? It matters for lots of different reasons, and two things in particular. Certainly when I came into Parliament in 2010, I was a plucky 28-year-old, and I was all about the division and taking on the other side, and I knew nothing else but opposition, because I came in when Labour was just out of government. And it took me a while to learn about, I suppose in answer to some of the points you made in your opening remarks, Aisha, about how you have to work together, and it might be the people that you deeply disagree with. So I sat on the Health and Social Care Select Committee with Johnny Mercer for a while. People may know who he is. And we disagreed vehemently on many different things, but we found common ground on things to do with mental health. And together, why it mattered was that we could disagree in those other things, but come together as we change laws in this country. And particularly as an opposition MP, it was finding that common ground in order to work to actually affect the change. I was also struck by what Luke said about the country being exhausted about this state that we find ourselves in. And I have, over the course of the past year, rejoined the Labour Party and found myself knocking on doors in various constituencies and target seats across the country. Now, when I first got involved in politics and started campaigning, you'd over the course of a session, for anyone that might have been canvassing, you knock on some doors, and you might get the odd person saying, oh, they'll close the door in your face, can't stand politics, not interested. I've been really, really struck that from the canvassing and door knocking I've done over the course of the past year, how many doors I'm knocking on now, where in some places it's the majority of people for whom they will close the door in your face and say, I hate you all, I can't bear the argy-bargy that goes on, I can't bear what I see. I think it's doing a massive disservice to our democracy. I think we're going to see one of the lowest turnouts at the next general election. I think in part it's the responsibility of politicians to do what we're talking about today, to disagree well, to contend with this. I think it's existential to the situation that we find ourselves in, and I don't say that lightly. What are the things that we can be doing? So I was, it was a lesson and it was a journey for me to work out how to disagree well and how to engage and listen to constituents when they come to me en masse and discuss issues where we would have very, very different and distinctive views. I'm thinking about the debates and discussions we had on things like mitochondrial donation when the law was changing, debates around gay marriage. I think in part, I learned that it's really important to just stop and listen, and we've got two of these and one of these, and we should spend more time listening and making sure that people are heard. I'm also really struck by, and I know the discussion today isn't about what happens online, but what happens online, I think, certainly polarises the debates and discussions even further, I'm really concerned about the issues around misinformation and disinformation. And I say that with the piece of work I'm doing at the moment around mental health. The greatest source of information, I say information, I use that word loosely, on mental health in the world is TikTok. There's over 100 billion posts with the hashtag mental health. Someone did a study of those posts, and over 80% of them contain disinformation and misinformation. That's just one example. There are many different examples of where this misinformation, disinformation exists, which I think polarizes, and I think therefore it's incumbent on all of us to take more care and consideration, to think about and be more critical about what we're hearing and seeing and reading, and particularly online, because that, of course, informs our own view. And I'm also keen, and I'm also, I think on a journey about what we can and should be doing to broaden our minds at whatever opportunity. And again, coming back to what we hear and see online, we are a product of the algorithms that are presented to us. And we have to do more to get out of our own echo chambers and challenge those algorithms that just feed off what the systems think that we know and like, in order to ensure that we are learning about different perspectives to broaden our views so that we are open to the perspectives of others.
Very much. Thank you, Luciana. Some really important points. And I think it is really important to just note that often the kind of shop window for politics is the heat of Prime Minister's questions or some very ferocious debates or, question time and things like that. But actually behind the scenes, and it doesn't get much media attention, and this is my journalist hat because we love a stooshy in the media and we love the drama, there is often a lot of really good cross-party working that happens behind the scenes and doesn't get reported about. And I think there's so many issues, actually, I think the country would really like politicians to come together on, whether it's big challenges of the day. You look at something like social care, that is a problem which, successive governments have failed to get a grip on. You look at the housing crisis right now. I mean, I've just joined the House of Lords, and it's a very, very, very different atmosphere in the House of Lords. It is much less confrontational. And people have very, very different views, but it's about making arguments rather than hurling insults at people. So it is interesting that you talk about, Luke mentioned about how do you, at the moment, sort of conflict is almost incentivized and harmony is never rewarded, like harmony in politics and coming together. And maybe that's something that we in the media and other people should celebrate a bit more and talk about more. Look at, like this week, there was a very big vote which won by one vote, which was about if MPs who'd been accused of sexual harassment, some sanctions against them. But actually that was a coalition of Liberal Democrats, of Labour people coming together, and actually that's very productive sort of cross-party working that you don't hear that much about. Ryan, let's hear from you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and some really interesting thoughts. I think debating it's got a kind of bad rep now. It's become quite a sort of tribal, polarised, aggressive, personal act. It's seen as that, rather than something which actually should be quite fun, educational, and public. It is a public thing rather than something which is necessarily deeply personal, and I think that's an important differentiation. And I think we need to see debating in that light for three reasons, really. The first is that it's a chance to learn and to practice. The second, as I say, is it's a public endeavour, not a private one, not a personal one. And I think the third thing that we need to think about is when we're entering into debate, that most people have good intentions, and that intentions matter. So on the first one, the chance to learn, we've already heard about the kind of John Stuart Mill worldview. And there are, yes, social benefits from debate. It gets us nearer to the truth. But there are individual benefits as well, that we learn a lot more through the process of debating. And I think for what we're sort of slowly creeping into is Jonathan Haidt, in his new book, The Anxious Generation, talks about two mental modes. The first is the kind of discovery mode, where we have a secure base and we feel we can go out into the world and learn and discover stuff. And then there's a defense mode, where we see threats and are anxious. And I think sometimes we're seeing debating or entering debating in that defense mode rather than a discovery mode, a chance to learn. And heard about John Stuart Mill. One of my favourite philosophers is Karl Popper. And Karl Popper talks about, we can never know 100% what the absolute truth is. We can falsify things, but we need debate and coming together, collective intelligence, to slowly improve our knowledge and work towards truth, even though individually we can never 100% find it. I think the other personal benefit from debating comes from the chance to practice. It's a public thing, as I say, so there are risks with that. You're held to account for the things that you say. So you've got to get your arguments right. You've got to do your research. You've got to practice your lines. You've got to hone your arguments, synthesize the evidence so you don't look silly when you're debating. And they are all really good skills for improving your knowledge. So debating is a very educational thing. It's positive and it's educational. The second is it's a public endeavour, and we should remember that rather than seeing it as an intensely personalised thing. And we typically debate, almost always debate in public forums, on stage here, in PMQs, social media, in seminars, around the pub table. And essentially, we're performing when we're debating. We're putting on our public face. Now, that's not me saying I'm pretending to be somebody else. We all have different sides to our personality that come out in different forums. But we should recognize that in debate, we're going onto a stage and that we can leave that stage and go into a new realm after we've debated. So when inevitably I fall out with Aisha on the stage today, I know that when we go backstage and have dinner later, we'll have a more...
You're dead to me. You're dead to me, right?
We'll have a much more jovial and friendly discussion. So thinking about debate in that way, I think, is really important. And I think, the phrase, the personal is political, which many of you would probably sort of learnt about in seminars, I think can be useful in some ways, but I think it may have gone a bit too far, and that we're sort of personalising too much politics. On dating apps now, it says, are you a Tory or whatever, and it's, in a way, because traditional ways of forming our identity, whether that's through religion, through community, those things have declined, and politics, I think, has become more central to how we form our identity and how we think about ourselves, as psychologists say, our schemas, how we see the world and how we think about ourselves within it. But as Luke said, we have multiple identities and multiple views on things, and what we say in a particular political argument doesn't define us. We also have our job, the volunteerings that we do, the friends that we have, the family. Politics is just one part, an important part, but one part of many attributes of our personality. And I worry a little bit that there's a sort of trend to try and politicize everything. Every act or comment that somebody says, a police officer or random member of the public, that we try and politicize that. We try and impose our worldview onto that when that person hasn't really been thinking anything political about what they've said. Sure, they may have made mistakes, they may have approached it the wrong way, but we try and politicize it and say, there's a kind of reason behind it which fits with the worldview that I've already got, and there's a danger of that. And I think the third thing that we need to go into debate with when we approach debate is that intentions matter, and most people have good intentions. No one's perfect, of course. People get things wrong, but intentions matter. And Jonathan Haidt, who's why I keep saying I think is very compelling, talks about in his book, The Righteous Mind in the US, how liberals and conservatives think very differently, and liberals prioritize particularly views around harm and around people being free, whereas conservatives tend to think about things like authority and sanctity when they think about their worldview. So most people, when they set out what their argument is, they're not doing it because they're malevolent. You know, there are psychopaths, obviously, unfortunately, in the world, but most people believe in what they say because they believe in it morally. And we have to respect that intention. And I think it's important to do so. So, yeah, I just think at the moment debating has got a bad rep, when actually it can be a very positive, fun thing, and it is essentially a public act, and we should remember that.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think you've made some brilliant points there, particularly about the art of debate and how a lot of people are kind of quite nervous about debate as well. And there's actually a brilliant charity called Debate Meet, which goes into schools and teaches young people about debating. And I've been to sort of see some of the sort of workshops they do. And actually, I'd like them to come into Parliament, because it is like, it's a kind of a reminder of first principles. And you're absolutely right, that going into a debate is not like absolutely kind of, you know, rinsing the other person on a personal level. It's about working out what your arguments are. And actually, some of the young people that have gone on from Debate Me, it's so brilliant for their brains. They've gone on to do like absolutely amazing things with their careers, because it's very good for your intellectual development to learn how to debate properly. And often the challenge is actually to give people a topic that they might not naturally agree with and get them to debate that, to just get the rigour of doing a debate. And actually, one thing I've just been covering on my radio show this week is that it's 30 years since I think one of the greatest political debaters in this country sadly died. Many of you may be too young to not remember him. Some of you in the audience will remember him, John Smith, who was dubbed, he was a leader of the Labour Party. He came after Neil Kinnock and he came before Tony Blair. And he was an incredible debater. He was actually dubbed, he died of a heart attack. He was dubbed the best Prime Minister we never had. And he actually came up through Glasgow University, had a fantastic tradition of the debating society where, you know, people from all different political backgrounds would debate, trade unionists would come and debate. And it was the real art of oratory and the real kind of skill on how you debate with evidence, but also with a lot of wit as well. And the kind of, Google John Smith and look at some of his speeches. And what was brilliant about somebody like him was sometimes his most kind of ferocious and memorable attacks against the opposition, John Major, they were so funny, even John Major laughed at them. They weren't kind of horrible personal attacks. They were so brilliantly and acutely well observed that even the front benches on the Conservative side were like shaking with laughter, which is a good sign. So look, we've all had a very nice kind of cosy discussion about why we should all sort of get along. I want to sort of drop a little bit of grit into the oyster. There might be some people watching this online or some people in the audience who are saying, look, it's all fine and well, us saying everyone's got to play nice and everybody's got to sort of find common ground and everyone's got to agree. But there are many people who feel so strongly about certain things. It's linked not just to their identity, but they almost feel there's an existential threat to their identity because of the idea that the other person is promulgating. It could be geopolitics, it could be about conflict, it could be about trans rights, it could be BLM, it could be a number of issues. And they won't always accept us, and we're all, you know, well-connected people. They might say, well, hang on, it's all right for you guys to say, have a cozy establishment, you know, conversation, and you can have a disagreement, and then you can go off and have dinner together. But for a lot of us, our lives are ruined by political decisions, whether it's austerity, whether it's, you know, things in, you know, people losing their jobs or something like that. It's not easy for those people. They care so passionately about it because for some people it's a matter of life and death. They will reject the argument that we've all made, which is, come on, everybody, play nice. I just want to sort of hear from the panel briefly on that. Luke, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and look, it is a challenge. I mean, I think, again, a lot about the trans debate in particular. For, you know, there'll be some trans people who think the whole debate is about debating their existence, and some gender-critical feminists who think the whole debate is about rolling back hard-won women's rights. It is immensely difficult. It is immensely bound up in people's identity. I guess what I would say, and appreciate it's much easier for me to say, is think about where do we want the debate to go, and where can we make progress on the debate? We tried a really interesting experiment when we were doing focus groups on gender identity, where we would start off most of the focus group by saying, what do you think about the trans debate? And most people would start with like, gosh, it must be really difficult, particularly if you're young, struggling with your gender identity, and then they get into, how can we make life easier? We've got some red lines and some concerns. We tried some of the focus groups where we started by talking about trans women in women-only sports, and the discussion was totally different. From the outset, it was hostile. From the outset, it was all about, oh, I'm really worried about this. This is totally unfair. This isn't right. And I think what it was a microcosm of the ways into these debates and discussions really matter. Lots of people will start from a position of compassion, but if you go into sport, actually, if you go into the most edgy topic, you're immediately going to set things up for conflict. And the truth is that for most trans people, elite sport isn't the number one concern. It's not where they want the debate to start. It's actually about how can I get decent access to healthcare. So I think one way, and there are others, is about bringing it back to what do we actually want the debate to be about, and how can we actually make progress on it.
Thanks for that. Sue, what do you think about the fact that, you know, for some people, they can't have a sort of moderate conversation because they feel so passionate?
Yeah, I think we need some more clarity, I guess, about what those avenues are to make change. And I think that comes back to the political literacy point that I made at the beginning, that I was looking at some research the Electoral Commission had done last year after the local elections. And they saw that only 32% of people were satisfied with how democracy works. So I think that's part of the issue. If people don't feel that they're doing all of that they can within the constraints of democracy, they're voting, they're talking to their MPs, they're trying to make change, then that becomes that sort of tipping point where people feel that they have to take more extreme actions. And one of the things that we've been talking about at the Foundation recently is the recent protests taking place at MPs' houses, and we feel very strongly that whatever it is that you feel strongly about, you should not take that to an MP's home. But a lot of those debates, when various different groups are saying, but I believe so strongly, if it was anything else, I wouldn't go and stand outside an MP's house. But I feel so strongly about this that it's the only thing that I feel I can do. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think we are seeing that from lots of different groups who are feeling that they just don't know how to then take their cause further because they just don't feel they're being heard.
And Jeff, that's a problem, isn't it? Because there is a lot of people who feel so frustrated by the political system at the moment. And let's not forget, we have just had quite draconian anti-protest laws passed in this country, making it, you know, more difficult for people to protest. A lot of people do feel that their political leaders are very remote from them now. And so let's say over the conflict in Gaza, where people feel so passionate, they might have the view, which is, I feel so passionate about this, I can't really get anywhere close to politics because I'm locked out of it. So I am going to go and demonstrate at this MP's house because this is how strongly I feel. Where are the limits on protest and free speech and disagreement?
Right, so just an easy question then. Good.
Yeah. That's why they pay you the big bucks.
Well, there we are. I mean, one question about protesting outside MPs' houses is to step back and say, what kind of people do we want to bring into politics? And if there is a standard tactic of making it very difficult for members of parliament to live safe, private lives, then you're going to drive out lots of the kinds of people that you want to get into politics. So anyone who feels so strongly about an issue that they want to go right up to an MP's house, I understand why they feel like that. But there is this bigger question of what are the norms about how we relate to our members of parliament that are likely to bring the right kinds of people into politics that I think we need to address when thinking about the permissibility of that tactic. I think protest and demonstration are an ordinary and appropriate part of a democratic society. And in the free speech tradition, we think street protest is an extremely valuable part of public discourse. It doesn't need to be having polite conversations over tea all the time. And the kinds of conversations we're having in, say, my political philosophy seminars at UCL, my thought isn't that every conversation about politics just needs to mirror that. There's going to be lots of different kinds of political
and
debate.
Do you have like conflict in your seminars?
Absolutely, we have conflict in our seminars, and I found students to be absolutely willing to engage in really robust and difficult discussions about topics that do implicate their identity. But they try not to make it personal. They try to make it about laying out the arguments, laying out the ideas. And if they think an argument is repugnant, then they pinpoint exactly why it's repugnant. So Habermas, the German philosopher, has this great phrase, the unforced force of the better argument. It's about showing people exactly where they're wrong. Now, just last thing I'll say on that, there are limits. So I think it is appropriate to have rules against threatening, inciting language. I think it is appropriate to have narrowly defined rules against speech inciting hatred. But once we've specified what those rules are, there's still going to be a lot of robust, emotional, angry discussion. And I think that's an inevitable part of democratic life. It's exhausting, but it's part of what we have to do in a society that is as imperfect as ours is.
And look, Luciana, you've had your time on frontline politics when there was a lot of disagreement. There was a lot of really intense disagreement, particularly within the Labour Party. You found yourself really at the sort of sharp end. You're somebody who ended up walking away from the Labour Party. How does politics manage these very, very, very difficult questions and these big philosophical differences and moral differences and religious differences and big, big differences, but with the right guardrails so that other people don't have the experience you had, which ultimately drove you to leave a political party, and you had a very bruising time?
Let me try and deconstruct all those very, very important points that you just made, Aisha. The first thing to say is I did leave the Labour Party, and subsequently the Labour Party was found during the period that I left it to have broken the Equality Act and to have intimidated and harassed some of its members, of which I was a part. So that was the reason why I personally left the Labour Party. It wasn't a decision that I expected to ever have to consider, let alone take. And it was a very, very difficult moment. And I think it's a poor reflection of what was going on in the Labour Party at that time. And we find ourselves, when it comes to Labour Party politics, at a very, very different moment. And I count myself really fortunate that even in spite of everything that happened, that I am still here, we are having the conversation. I don't make that point lightly. I saw during my time in Parliament 6 people convicted for the abuse and the threats they directed towards me. 4 of those people served prison sentences. And I think for anyone to go through one of those processes is more than enough, let alone 6. And we shouldn't have that in our politics. Take me personally out of that situation. I want to see a chamber that reflects all of British society. If you happen to stumble across the Parliament channel, it still doesn't. We've made some progress, but we should have a politics where people want to put themselves forward, want to engage in public life, want to make a contribution. And I think we're very far from that at this moment in time. So I see this again as part of kind of the challenge around the future of our democracy and the future of our politics 365 days a year for all the years intervening in between general elections, that we have a responsibility to do it. And yes, it's very easy just to kind of chat because, we're going to, be involved in the organisations we're involved in at a later moment. And for many people, they are incredibly frustrated. And there's 2 things that speak to that. One, I think politicians have a responsibility to lead by example. And that's of all parties and political persuasions, from Parliament down to local council level. That is not the case, and I think the work of the Jo Cox Commission around civility is really important. Those recommendations all matter. I contributed to that commission, and I want to see all of them enacted to make a difference to the future. I think that element is really, really important. And then in terms of... forgive me, I forgot my second point. But,
that's fine.
Yeah.
But just one question to come back to, as you say, you would not wish what happened to you on anybody, regardless of their political background or anything. Would you still, given that we know the threats, particularly against women, against ethnic minority, women against Jewish women, would you still encourage women to go into politics?
I have, and I do, and I will. And I think it's really important. but I count myself really fortunate that I've had the resilience to go through that. I don't take that resilience for granted, and I'm struck by the experience of others at all different levels of public life who have experienced abuse and intimidation, have had those protests outside those homes, and for them and their loved ones and their people that they have caring responsibilities for and their family, it's too much. And again, that's why this debate and this discussion is so important, because it shouldn't be too much for anyone. We should have the circumstances in which anyone can consider putting themselves forward, and when they're in public life as well, that they feel that, yes, they can stand up for the things that they care deeply and passionately about, even if they are contentious and difficult, but they aren't, as a result of it, going to see people convicted because those people have crossed the line and have threatened them and their families. And in some cases, people, I had to spend time away from the home, which is where I lived, because it wasn't deemed safe for me to do so. Like, that is not acceptable in a democracy, and those are the things that we have to work against.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Ryan, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, you made a brilliant case about the importance of the sort of debating club and the tactics of debating, but, real life emotion gets in the way, real life passion gets in the way. A lot of people, as Luciana alluded to, feel so frustrated by what they see as a sort of broken political system that they do feel they have to voice their concerns in a way which we might think is uncouth or unpalatable or sails close to the wind. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And I recognise the strength of feeling that people have, particularly if it affects them profoundly and deeply, and it's transformed their life, often in negative ways. I understand that. I think the response back is, the first is, intellectual humility, which is, often we don't know things for certain, and we should approach in that spirit. The saying, the more you read, the more you find out that you don't know, is the correct one. So, we may have certainty over some things, but we should recognise some humility around that. The second is, I think intentions again matter, and in a democratic politics, you're not going to get your way all the time. There are too many people with different viewpoints, and you have to compromise. And even politicians, that's the job of a politician, is the trade-offs between different things. And not everybody is going to be satisfied, but we're going to find a way that is a compromise between different positions. And people have to recognise that in a pro-social way, that you are not always going to get what you want. And another great philosopher, because you're in the room, I'm inspired to talk about them, is Isaiah Berlin, the great liberal philosopher, who talked about different principles, different desirable principles, whether it's security, freedom, prosperity. All of these things matter, and often they're on a spectrum, and we want more with one, and that's fine. And so respecting those different principles that exist that within us all when we want these things at different times, but across different people as well, means that we're often going to come to a compromised position. And then the third and final thing I was going to say is, this is a crude characterization. Some people might disagree with me on this, but when people think about life outcomes, sometimes the left think a lot of the life outcomes that we experience is down to discrimination, power dynamics. And sometimes that can kind of lend itself to be quite conspiratorial, that people in power are sort of pulling strings and stopping people from achieving things. Again, a crude characterization. Again, on the right, sometimes people think life outcomes are to do with individual agency, just how much effort you put in, and you get the reward from that. Whereas my feeling really is that a lot of life is a lot more random. It's a result of luck or bad luck in people's lives. And what I'm saying from that is that actually sometimes when people feel that there's been a deep injustice, it's not because people are being malevolent or there's a lack of agency. It's because people are just not aware of it. They're busy in their lives. There's lots of other things to think about. So I think that's another thing. It's quite a sort of long-winded thing to say, but I think it's another vital thing to say about people, that often they're not acting from malevolence. It's either benign ignorance and or good intentions.
Excellent. Right, we have now got some time for audience questions. We've got about 25 minutes, so there's going to be lots of time to get your questions in, and also keep your questions coming in on the slide. It's working, thank goodness. The sort of title is Disagreeing Well. So can we have the lights up a bit so that I can see my lovely audience here? And I think we're going to do some batches of 3. We've got a lady, 2 people at the back there with their hands up. We'll take you, and then a lady at the front in the blue. We'll take you 2 together. And then, if you could just see your name, and if you could be quite brief with your question, we're just going to try and get through as many as possible.
Is this on? Excellent. Hi, thank you so much. My name is Anastasia. I'm actually from DebateMate, so thank you so much for that.
Tell Margaret I've done my bit.
We will. And we work a lot with businesses. We deliver communication and leadership training. And what we have seen recently is there is a real divide between generations. And generations have not been able to disagree well. And so I want to ask the whole panel about solutions, possible solutions, how to regain that connection between generations in the workplace, in public life, wherever that may be. Thank you so much.
Great question, Anastasia. Lovely. And I think the lady next to you had a question as well.
I'm also part of DebateMate, so thank you again, Aisha, for that shout out. Do you want me to give the microphone to someone else?
Just very briefly, though, because we do need to spread it out a little bit, but very, very briefly.
Of course, don't want to dominate the conversation. As part of the debating curriculum that we teach at schools, but also in our corporate training, we stress the importance of defining the question that we're actually debating so that we know what we're disagreeing and agreeing about in the first place. How do you actually set that foundation in public discourse when it's one-liners or quick videos that actually pull people's attention to the debate in the first place?
Brilliant, great question. Now, lady at the front here with the blue blazer. Yeah, I think we're going to get a microphone down to you. If you just give us your name, and I think we're going to get a microphone to you if you just wait 2 ticks.
Hi. Hello, my name's Catherine Riley, and I'm a Professor Emeritus of Urban Education here. And I start by agreeing with you that many times people have very different views and very different intentions. I've been an elected politician at the thing called the Inner London Education Authority. There were some, for the Labour Party, some amazingly interesting Labour politicians, Conservative politicians who I disagreed with politically, but they had good intent. I worked for the World Bank for a couple of years, and I was present at one of the most brilliant debates I've ever heard, which was about the marketization of education in Chile, and so had very opposing views. Brilliant. I find myself kind of struggling, which is why I'm here today. My work is on schools as places of belonging, got big projects all over the country. And my heart hurts when I look at, I was doing something, a project in Walsall, looking at information on child poverty, looking at the state we're in, looking at the fact, the one that really, really got me was that on infant mortality, we're one of the worst in Europe now. And you think, how could this be? I find it really hard to say people who are really, in a sense, in the camp politically have supported that to say, okay, let's have a debate about it. So I don't know how. And if you go to places like Walsall and you really see what's going on, I'm so angry about what I see. I'm so angry about what's happening in schools. I'm so angry about the discourse that blames it on families and communities, and it is truly appalling. And I do my best as the academic to be reasonable, but I find this really hard to have a debate when you look at the state of what is happening to our children and young people.
Great point, Catherine, really great point. Lovely. So we're not going to go to every single person for every single question, but so I'll just sort of give them to you. Like, Sue, I'll come to you. This point that Anastasia made about the generational divide being a real kind of sticker, and I think you're so right about that point. There's obviously a massive amount of division between generations. We certainly saw it on the sex-based rights versus transgender, and we've seen it on lots of other things as well. What can be done to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, and probably the most shocking piece of information I found when we were doing all of our work on the Civility Commission report was some polling that had been done about what people's general attitude to abuse and intimidation of politicians was. And a question was asked to quite a large sample about what they thought was acceptable. And one of the questions was, is it acceptable to verbally abuse an MP in the street? And broadly, about 5% of people said it was acceptable. That figure rose to 16% of 16 to 24-year-olds, and was much, much lower for anyone who's over 70. So they're obviously, on big issues, not just this, obviously, there are those big generational divides. So I think there's a couple of things that I think could be done. I think one of them is around diversity in Parliament, if we're thinking specifically around Parliament. I went to an event last night, which was a brilliant event about empowering women into politics, and we had a really great spread of people there, including our youngest member of the House of Lords, who's 27, and she was saying one of the brilliant things that can be done is seeing more people like us, seeing more diversity in Parliament, and I think that's really important to help increase that debate that we're having. And I think in general, if we're not just thinking in political life, it's about finding opportunities to bring people together. So one of the things that we do at the Jo Cox Foundation is called the Great Get Together. It's an event that we do every June where we bring people together in communities and encourage them to meet people who are not like them. And overwhelmingly, when people have that opportunity, they want to do more of it. So I just think finding those spaces where people can come together, have those genuine conversations, can make a real difference.
And Jeff, what are your thoughts on that? Because you're obviously working with a lot of younger people here on campus debating these big issues. What do you think about this generational divide? Because it is a real thing.
It's a real thing. I do find that it is entirely possible to engage students on complicated, difficult questions in the course of our classes. So we do debate questions about income inequality and economic injustice in our classes. We talk about injustice in the criminal justice system and what the right principles are that should guide our reforms in those spaces. And I think it is about, in part, curating the right kinds of spaces to have these conversations. I think it would be wonderful if we had more opportunities to bring people from different generations into conversation with one another. So I'm part of an initiative here at UCL that will be bringing students into local area schools so that students within our institution can talk to those who are even younger than them. It would be wonderful to expand it outward so that they were engaging with people who are seniors who do have time on their hands to participate in these kinds of debates and conversations. So thinking creatively about how to expand the spaces would be really valuable, I think.
And Luciana, you wanted to come in on this?
Just to say, when I first came into Parliament, I was 28. And I was still one of, at the time, for many, many years, I was one of the few MPs that was still paying off their student loan. So when we were having debates around student finance, I was one of the few people that could reflect on that. But I was struck that there's a number of journalists, not just journalists, other people that don't think we should have MPs under the age of 40. I think there's a big job to be done to encourage people at all ages. The piece of work that I've just been doing at the moment, again, it's come up so many times. I was in the northwest of England and I was with a group of very eminent leaders, and they're like, oh, we've just looked at this study and we've actually surveyed our young people and we're so struck by what we've heard and learned, like we didn't know any of this. So data and surveys, I think, are really important, and actually taking the time to listen and understand. There are generational changes. We see that in the workplace all the time. Everyone talks about the Gen Z difference. But certainly there's a big job to be done, I think, to understand what those differences are in order to come together.
Ryan, to pick up Professor Catherine's point of view, because I think what you've expressed really gets to the nub of, look, this is the sort of nice academic conversation we're having about disagreeing kind of politely, but I could hear the passion in your voice about the injustice you feel, about the poverty you see and the anger you feel. Ryan, what are your thoughts? Because you're obviously thinking deeply about this, Catherine, but you're being human. You're struggling with it, and a lot of people are.
Yeah, and lots of people across the political spectrum are obviously very concerned about the level of poverty, and I can tell that you're very passionate about it. My response would be that there is disagreement across the political spectrum on what is the nature of poverty. Is it to do with lack of money? Is it to do with being lonely and having poor relationships? Is it lack of family stability? There is debate about what is poverty. There's also a debate about the causes of poverty. Is it individual factors? Is it structural factors? There are genuine debates around that. I think there's debates around the different definitions of what counts as poverty. There's absolute measures, there's relative measures, and even within relative measures, there are different ways of calculating it. And according to which the measure you use, there's different trends that have happened in recent years. And then there's also debate about the solutions that you should focus on. Is it around adequate cash transfers? Is it around incentivizing people into work? Is it about intervening early to give parents better support and the tools they need to create more stability? So I don't necessarily think there's a lack of will. I think there's a disagreement over all of those things. And at the heart of it, really, is that there are trade-offs. There are, if I put too much money into cash transfers to supporting people who are poor, does that alter work incentives? Is there a point in which that dampens work incentives? So there's a trade-off there. And there's a trade-off with spending on different areas, because there are loads of other areas that government and taxpayers feel are important. So how much resource of the finite pot that is available should go to poverty alleviation measures against other things? So I suppose I'm trying to disagree slightly, which is I think there is genuine debate. The intentions are good, but there are trade-offs and differing views on all of those, what's the solutions, how you measure it, the nature of it, the causes.
Look, I mean, I think kind of the sort of dilemma that Catherine finds herself in is something that a lot of people will, I mean, lots of questions are coming here on the Slido to that effect as well, saying, look, I'm all for the concept of disagreeing well, but I am so raging at what I think is going wrong in this country now, whether it's the NHS, whether it's education, whether it's child poverty, etc., etc. And they find it really difficult to sort of have a kind of, I mean, this sort of alludes to a question we were saying before, but I mean, Catherine's exemplified it very, very passionately. I mean, when you're doing your sort of research and you're out doing your focus groups, what do you pick up from people about that?
There is no doubt that huge swathes of Britons are furious about the state of the country at the moment. They don't understand why they can't get a GP appointment when they pay for and support the NHS. They don't understand why the weekly shop costs twice as much as it used to do, and they're having to put things back for the first time. There is lots that people are angry about, but what I would perhaps pull it back to is we're talking about those involved in public life, those who are debating and discussing these issues. And there are two ways that people in public life can go about sort of advocating for change. One is, and I think this is a really unhealthy trend, which is sort of righteous anger, which is designed to secure in-group approval. It's not designed to persuade, it's designed to make people who already agree with you even more. And social media particularly inflames that. So that's one way. Or there's another way, which is, okay, I'm really angry about this, but I'm in a position of authority here. How do I go about building a coalition for change? And I often don't think anger is the way to do that. I think about something like gay marriage, which I was lucky enough to be involved in the campaign for. So much of that was about debating and discussing with people who fundamentally disagreed with the concepts of gay relationships being normal, but until we addressed the concerns of social conservatives, we weren't getting it through, right? That was the only way that we could do it, was by meeting them, things like the triple lock, which wasn't my preferred policy, but actually sometimes you've got to think the anger is useful in building up passion, but actually if I'm going to persuade and build a coalition, you need something more.
Great questions. I'm going to take a few questions. Slido. I'm going to appeal to my lovely panellists. They're very educated people. They love their words. I'm going to ask them to just be a little bit briefer with their answers because there's so many questions coming in. The art of debate is also being concise as well. Right. Okay. Now, this is a great question. Jeff, I'm going to come to you. I'm just going to do one per person. How do we ensure that we leave space for disagreeable opposing views without risking tolerating opinions with potentially dangerous societal consequences later on? This is a great question, whoever put this in.
So I'll reiterate a point I made earlier, which is that there is scope for narrow prohibitions against varieties of seriously harmful speech. But you have to write the rule in a way such that you're happy with what's likely to be caught by that rule. And so that means all relevant legal prohibitions against speech or institutional prohibitions are going to be under-inclusive, and that there's going to be lots of bad speech that could well contribute to societal harm that will be allowed in the final analysis. And what that means is that the task of combating those bad ideas is one of counter-speech. It's one of arguing back against those ideas. And just picking up on this issue about anger, I don't think disagreeing well means disagreeing with complete calmness and emotional detachment from the views that we're discussing. It is about bringing our passion and reason to the debate at the same time.
Sue, I'll give you this next question from Lalith, who asks, if you could start again, how would you redesign Britain's democratic structures to bring out the best in political debate, collaboration and public engagement? Just an easy one for you, because you have got your report close at hand.
Yeah, of course, and only in a couple of minutes. I think there's something that we could do about emphasising the collaborative nature of politics as it exists, and we've already touched on this, that the things that we see are PMQs. We see people kind of making cheap jibes at each other. So I think that there would be a lot more that we could do to emphasise the things that go on behind the scenes, and to make more of that when people sit in committees like Luciana and Johnny Mercer and actually find things that they have in common. And I think finding ways that we could take that very public disagreement out of it and pay more attention to the areas where people actually do work together. And Jo Cox was a great example of that. She was known for finding people who she thought she could work with. She when she was elected, she asked Andrew Mitchell, somebody she said she would disagree with on lots of things, to be the co-chair of the APPG on Syria, because that was something that they agreed on, and that was an area that they could bring about change. So I think emphasising those areas of collaboration is absolutely key.
Excellent answer. You did that very, very well. I know PMQs is really bad, but I have written a very good book about it called Punch and Judy Politics, available in all good bookstores. Just getting that out there, just in case you were interested. Right. Now, this is a question for you, Ryan. I'll put this one to you, which is, can you give us an example? There's so much bad debate at the moment. This person said it doesn't feel like we see much respect, empathy and compassion in public debate. Can you think of any recent examples where there has been a public political debate that's been conducted well?
Wow, that's a difficult question. Can you come back to me on that? Because I don't know the answer at the moment.
I'll put a difficult one to Luke now, but I'm only giving you a short period of time, so just answer it briefly so he can have a horrible time as well. Okay, so I'm trying to be fair. Now, this is a brilliant question. This is from Jamaat, who says that this theory, this discussion has all been very interesting, but show us this in practice. What is something that someone else has said that you have totally disagreed with and thought, what a load of rubbish? Not me, obviously, because I'm right about everything, obviously, but like these guys.
Well, I actually think Ryan
Look
talking
at your body
about,
language.
I agree. I think I actually slightly disagree with Ryan on it being a bad thing, people putting their ideological preferences on dating apps, because I do think for some people that is going to matter, and we should accept it matters. And the idea of going home and arguing with your partner about the fundamentals all the time. And actually, I think part of the reason people do it more now is because we used to a model of relationships which was the man had political views and the woman didn't. As we've moved into a more gender equal, or wasn't supposed to, I should say, we've moved into a more gender equal society. It's more important that you know that your partner is going to be congruent with you on things.
Okay. Very good answer. I love you. I don't really disagree. Very, very, very good. Now, okay, Ryan, give us an example of, if you think, a political debate that's been conducted well recently. I've thought of one, if I can save you if necessary, but go on.
I can't believe, Luke, you turned against me. That's it.
Fight.
I would say, I'm struggling, to be honest, so I feel like I'm slightly BSing here. But on COVID, I thought initially the debate was pretty good, because obviously it's a kind of unexpected, completely out of the blue, and there was a real feeling of, this is a crisis, we need to come together. And there was, I think, quite a good cross-party spirit, at least initially, around that. Which often happens when you have these big emergencies, these big external shocks. They're tragic and awful, but they can rally people around it. I'm
No,
struggling.
That's
so
fine.
hopefully
No,
that's
but
convincing.
I mean, that's an honest answer. And also, it's a sign of the times, isn't it? Which shows you how combative things. I actually thought the post office stuff recently in Parliament brought a lot of people together, because such was the absolute deep shock, revulsion, horror, pain that everybody felt about what had happened. And it was interesting that you know, the Labour Party absolutely kind of supported, you know, that was an emergency piece of legislation which was unopposed. And I thought that was quite an interesting example. Right.
The COVID thing as well, why I mentioned it was because nobody really was expecting it. So there was such intellectual humility around it. How do we resolve it? What are the tools that we use? There's not much examples that we can draw from. So that was quite useful for bringing people together.
I mean, it all slightly fell apart with Partygate, but that's a whole other, it's a whole other story. Right, we have got time for just a couple of questions. I'll go to this. Can I have the lights up a little bit? Lady at the back, hand up, and then, yeah, lady there with the black top on. We'll do you first, and then we only time for two, sorry. We'll do you, and then we'll go to the lady there. Yeah.
Hello. My question is...
What's your name?
My name's Shivali.
Thanks.
While disagreeing is important, agreeing on something is probably also quite important. That's based on something I heard recently, that to maintain a democracy, there needs to be a sense of national pride, which is something that is probably being eroded at the moment. So my question is, are there certain fundamentals that we need to agree on to be able to disagree well?
Great question. And then, lady just behind her there, yeah.
Hi. First of all,
What's your name?
Zoya. I'm a first-year student at UCL, so I apologize if my question isn't necessarily out of the box or challenging. But one thing that I do think is really important to question is, in anthropology, for example, one of the things we always discuss in our seminars and lectures is positionality and what role that plays in, you know, debates, arguments, and essays. And I think, especially, you know, with a panel of white people who obviously come from their own, you know, positions and places of privilege, I think it's really important to discuss what role that plays in these debates, because, you know, we can argue that things are compromises and that people, you know, will need to compromise and that there's trade-offs and that things are up to luck. But when you're a person who comes from a disadvantaged background, if you're born into poverty, if you're born a person of color or a woman of color, that's not luck, that's your life experience. And when you talk about ideologies being on dating profiles, I'm in a relationship with a white man, but if he says something that is, you know, offensive or, you know, open to debate, that's something that becomes a lot more personal to me. And, you know, it's really important to acknowledge and see how we can enforce acknowledging, not just, you know, listening to people, but acknowledging what role our own positionality plays into this discussion and how we can make room for that.
Yeah, great point. I'd like to say I'm Indian Muslim, but that's a great... Okay, let's start with Shivali's question, which is, you know, what are the kind of fundamentals that we should be able to agree on? Luke, I'll start with you.
Well, I think it is, you know, and this is where we are in a much better position than the US, I should say. It is the nature of how we resolve these disputes. I think, you know, we acknowledge that there's a role for protest, but I think most people still recognise that the democratic system is the basis for resolving those disputes. I think even though people might disagree with the result of elections, we find in the UK people tend to think that they're fair, even if they don't like the outcome of them. And I think those things matter more, and the willingness to sort of hear other people. If you look at the US, where they're losing sight of those fundamentals, I think they're in a much worse position, and there it's very hard to disagree well, because you disagree about the rules of the game.
Sue, what do you think about that? Because you do a lot of work in terms of, you know, finding things that are kind of common ground for people. What do you think are the sort of fundamentals about this sort of country or politics that we should agree on?
Yeah, when we're bringing people together, and it's something that makes people nervous, of course, because if you're having a discussion with someone who's really different from you, you don't know where to start. But there are things that you can talk about that will be easy conversation starters, and it might sound really simple, but things like food. Ask a question about what's your favourite food, and that works more in a community setting. This isn't talking about vast political debate, but I think sometimes starting with those small things that bring us together can help then when it comes to the bigger and more challenging questions.
And Jeff, do you think that there are things that we all fundamentally agree on right now in society?
I think that there is a common core of moral values that democracy depends on, And it's an empirical question for the pollsters to figure out how widespread they are. I'm optimistic that they're widespread, but it is a fundamental vision of persons as essentially free, by which I mean that entitled to chart their lives for themselves and chart their own course, and equal, and by that I mean that they're equally valuable, and that the way that persons so conceived as free and equal ought to relate to one another is through a cooperative democratic system. Now, those are like very basic assumptions, and then when we spell out what exactly they mean, that's where the disagreements arise. But if you don't share that common foundation, it's going to be very difficult to come to a consensus on any policy issues.
And Luciane, let's move on to Zoya's point, which is, it's quite easy to have this conversation if you are a person from a place of privilege. How do you have these conversations with people who are not from those positions of privilege, where these conversations are more difficult and because things are stacked against them structurally?
I think we're on a journey. I think we're not there yet as a country to make sure that we really, first and foremost, celebrate our differences and understand our differences, and also understand the kind of acute inequalities that we face in our country. And sorry, I spoke to some of them. There's many more, whether it's where you're from, where your background, how much money you're born into, whether you're a person of colour. There's so many different aspects which will, as we find our country today, unfortunately, it's more than unfortunate, it's in my mind not acceptable, but mean that you have much different outcomes. I see that in mental health in particular. There is so much more that we have to do. So we have to be better as a country to not just talk about the differences that we see, not just celebrate them, but actually do something. And unfortunately, because we're in a situation now where we've seen those inequalities widen, I can understand very deeply why people feel that inherent sense of frustration. And I suppose it speaks to the point I forgot to make before was, it's not just about how we debate these things well, but it's also about the promises and pledges that we make connected to it. And it's about the truths that we put forward. So I perhaps will disagree with you that I think there are some people that I've certainly engaged in debate with that will put forward a position which they know inherently to be untrue, or they'll make a pledge or a commitment or a promise connected to it which they know to be untrue. And I think we have a responsibility to speak the truth and make commitments and pledges and promises that we think there's a realistic outcome that we can deliver on. And I think those two things together are where we're quite far from and that we need to work on.
And Ryan, to Zoe's point, because I think you raised some really good points there, Zoe. And I'm a woman of colour. I'm a Muslim woman as well. I get a huge amount of Islamophobic abuse when in the public space in terms of debating. And I think sometimes if you've not had that lived experience of just getting that complete sort of discrimination and racism just for like existing, people don't even know anything about me and I get this sort of stuff, it can feel that if you're from a minority group, you're not on a level playing field when you're having these debates. What would you say to that?
I think it's a good point. I'm going to slightly disagree with the point, and slightly disagree with Luciana's characterisation of my earlier argument.
Oh, it's all kicking off now, isn't it?
When I'm not saying everybody has good intentions, I'm saying most people have good intentions. Yes, I think privilege is very important. I would just have a note of caution about assuming people are privileged based on certain socio-demographic characteristics. They are important, race, gender, without doubt, and you can see that in structural inequalities that exist, which prove that. But there are lots of hidden things about people and experiences that they've had which would not make them think that they are privileged, and indeed privilege is not a static thing as well. So I think we just need to be slightly careful with that language, is the first thing I would say. And the second thing is that although, of course, discrimination plays a role, I do take the view, which is different to some on the left, that it is the kind of dominant reason why certain life outcomes happen. I do think there is a role for randomness, and I do also think there's a role for individual agency. In fact, if there isn't a role for individual agency and everything's preset and predetermined by forces outside of our control, I find that quite a dystopian world, and I don't agree with that. So that's my difference. So I'm not denying that discrimination exists. It's on a spectrum, and I would probably have it have less of a contributory factor than perhaps others would.
We've come to the end of our time. It's been such a fascinating discussion. I'll just leave you with this, my own tale of people disagreeing with me. So I obviously get quite a lot of abuse on social media because I'm a woman, I'm a brown woman, I'm a Muslim woman, I'm on the left. But I got this the other day on Twitter, which was quite horrible. It was like, at Aisha Hazarika, why don't you spend less time slagging off Jeremy Corbyn and more time down the gym? That was for my mum. So yeah, I mean, this stuff can really wound even in families. Right, well, we have had a fantastic discussion. Just to let you know, there's a QR code. Please use that, which links to an evaluation form because we want to get your feedback on how well we disagreed. So do that. There's a little drinks reception after here in the North Cloisters, and we're delighted that Dr. Michael Spence is here to say goodbye to us.
Yes, look, thank you very much. I have the difficult task of summing up what was said this evening and of the very easy task of thanking Aisha and the panel. And like on these other occasions, I'm not going to attempt to sum it up, but I will give you something of my kind of pig-ignorant layperson's reflections. The first was that throughout the conversation there was a notion that public life should be nice or at least constructive. And I kept thinking about the history of public life, and it's a history of the guillotine, it's a history of assassination, history of civil war, history of coup d'etat. It's never kind of been all that nice, and where it has been nice, it's tended to be because certain kinds of chaps were in charge and they went to the same sorts of schools and they could have disagreements and then have dinner afterwards. Or where people shared a very thick layer of particular kinds of commitment, either political, moral, religious value or social values of one kind or another. It struck me as listening to the conversation that we're at a really particular point in political history where we have a great liberal experiment in which I know UCL deeply believes, because it is the experiment of which this university was such an important part, that was such an important part of the foundation of this university, that actually a community is stronger the more diverse it is, the more disagreement there is, that in fact disagreement shouldn't be hidden, that it is powerfully can be powerfully constructive. And we are at a point at which we've embraced diversity, and not only that, through social media, are hearing all sorts of voices that may once have been hidden, and yet doing that in a context in which there is a greater sense than ever that there are problems that together we must solve, like climate change, like inequality, like all of those sorts of things that again kept coming back in the conversation as sources of rage. So we've got this irony that we've embraced diversity and difference as a part of the liberal democratic project, and we believe in that, at a time when also we have these urgent problems. The thing that worried me as I listened to the conversation is the way in which that might backfire, that people on the doorstep were getting sick of disagreement, that they were getting sick of politicians arguing with one another. They were getting sick, in some senses, of the whole liberal project. And we see that in parts of politics in the West and beyond. So how do you respond to that? And I found the modelling notion really interesting. I think there is a particular responsibility on people in public life to model the kind of conversation that we were able to have this evening across what were really quite significant differences in terms of approach to the world and in terms of approach to the way forward. And we need to support our politicians as we do that. And that is a collective responsibility. But the second thing was, and I suppose this is because of my day job, it occurred to me again and again and again that we don't fight for liberal democracy, at least in the sense that we don't talk enough about the kinds of things that each of you talked about at the beginning. That is, how you disagree well, We don't talk about practicing epistemic humility. We don't talk enough about what it means to conceive of the possibility that you might be wrong, what it means to listen actively. And they're the sorts of skills that we're thinking at UCL about how we teach much more consciously, so that before you come to the tricky topics, you've actually thought about your positionality, or you've thought about ways in which you might listen more constructively, or you've thought about what it means to find common ground. We think that that's why this set of conversations is so important, and we think it's why the work that we're planning to do with our students is so important. Because if we are going to face those issues about which there is appropriately rage at the moment and do it together, these are the sets of skills that we're going to need. And we need them modelled, and you'll modelled them this evening extraordinarily well. And so once again, I'd like to thank Aisha for coming back and for hosting this particular discussion, and the panel for what was an incredibly stimulating conversation. So thank you very much. Thank you. Go and find something to drink.